We're going to be seated
Both of
the
you?
entire time, yes.
Okay, but you can create a rapport with the people as we start.
Yes.
And let it not just start immediately.
Okay. Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to be having an online session. So the team that's working on the online session requests that we sit in front so that then they could know that there are people here. So for all the people coming in, please take the front seats, and the people coming after you will take the seats behind you. And luckily, there's some motivation to sit in front, yeah? Yeah, there's so thank you. Yeah. In the next 7 minutes, 5 or 7 minutes, we'll be starting our dialogue today. So please bear with us. We're trying to see that we have our panel fully constituted. Thank you. session, so the people are waiting. The more we wait, we may have to lose them. So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mwebe Kalibala. I'm glad to be the facilitator for this dialogue today. So this is the 7th Advances in Geomatics Research Conference that is being organized by the Department of Geomatics and Land Management here in Makerere University. The theme of our conference today is Geomatics Excellence for a Modern Society, and we'll be talking about sustainable, fit-for-purpose solutions for the 21st century. The topic today for the dialogue is going to be the progress of the implementation of the Uganda National Land Policy 10 years after it was launched. I thought that I would give a brief of why we are here today before I do the pleasantries. So please, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this meeting. We're glad to have you. We're glad to have you be a part of this dialogue and conference. I know it's a part of a series of meetings that are happening here. And from us, the people at the panel, and the people organizing this meeting, we're glad to have you. We know that it's a mix of people that are in this room, but we know that it also, in the interest of time, would not be in our means to have all of you introduce yourselves. But what we would do is, at a point you have a submission, at a point you have a question or a comment, we'll ask that you first introduce yourself, and then we'll go forward and make your comment or question. And maybe the other thing is, we would love to recognize the different people in this room. For us, I come from a civil society background, and a background that talks about issues of land and land rights advocacy. And in our midst, we have people that have shaped the land discussion in this country. So we'd love to recognize Mr. Eddie Nsamba Gaiya, who's before us here. Please welcome Eddie. We would love to recognize Dr. Abi Sebina Ziwa, who also has done a lot to shape the space, the land space in this country. Please welcome Dr. Abi Sebina Ziwa. I'm not going to get to the other people in the room. I thought I would recognize the senior citizens, but those that have also done a lot in this sector. But also, in the interest of the organizers of this meeting, it will be within our interest to see that we can have a better, not a better, that we are going to do the introductions as they come. So, we know that this is an ongoing workshop, and we know that it has been organized here, and we know that for all the discussions that we'll be having around land, the national land policy, they are going to be feeding into the theme of geomatics excellence for a modern society. So together with me, please, let's invite Dr. Lydia Mazzi Kayondo, the head of department, to give the opening remarks for this dialogue. Let's put our hands together for Doctor to come and give her opening remarks.
Good afternoon, everybody. Our panelists today, and all protocol observed, you're all very, very welcome to this event. It is one of the pre-conference activities that we are having in preparation for the 7th Geomatics Advances Research Conference, which is happening tomorrow and on Friday. The land policy and its implementation is a very fundamental topic, and we felt like it will give us some energy to know what is happening around, and especially some feedback so that we can know what is happening, what is doing well, and what is not doing well. As our moderator mentioned, that we are a bit not on time, I beg to stop here and to wish you good deliberations. Please listen in and interact with our panelists. We took time to select the people that are here and be sure to get value for your time. Thank you once again for coming.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lydia. It's the confirmation that we are in an academic institution and not a political rally, where the discussions are done and the comments are in summary. So I just, in a minute, my greatest recollection of a dialogue like this in Makerere was a couple of years back when we were discussing the amendments that were done to the Land Act, not to the National Land Policy. And we had only students. And I believe that some of you here are students. And so when we go to the introductions, the one notable thing about the introductions is that the students didn't introduce themselves with regard to what they do at the university. Most of them stood and said, I'm Mwebe Kalibala, I come from Luwero. So they didn't say, I'm Mwebe Kalibala, I do social sciences. Yeah? And to us, that was major because it fit in the setting of an understanding of land as where it is you belong, and an understanding of land as something that is more than just land, but something around your life in itself. So as we get into these discussions on the National Land Policy, let us, especially for our dear students, let us sit back and reflect upon where we are coming from. Let us sit down and reflect upon what it is we feel is best suits the setting of land in our own homes and what it means to our lives. I don't want to spend much more time. I want to go ahead and introduce the panel. I'm going to introduce the panel all at once so that then we don't get into the introductions again. And I'm also going to set out the format of our deliberations today. First on my panel and right on my left is Ms. Naomi Kabanda. Ms. Naomi Kabanda is the Acting Director, Land Management, the Ministry of Lands, Housing and Urban Development. She has more than 25 years of experience in the field of land law, land administration and registration, policy development, and women land rights. She's been a part of the team initiating the policy and the legal reforms in the land sector. She is also the Ministry of Lands technical lead for the implementation of the National Land Policy. Ms. Naomi Kabanda is a lawyer by profession and an advocate of the High Court. Please welcome Ms. Naomi Kabanda. Next to Ms. Naomi Kabanda is Ms. Frances Birungi Odong. Ms. Frances Birungi Odong is the Executive Director for Uganda Community-Based Association for Women and Children's Welfare. And this organization works to promote human rights and welfare of women and children in Uganda using community-based initiatives. She's currently the chairperson of the National Land Coalition in Uganda and coordinates the Stand for Her Land campaign in Uganda. She's a feminist and a passionate gender and human rights and development specialist with over 20 years professional experience in designing and managing programs. Frances works with grassroots communities to promote grassroots women's self-efficacy, agency, and leadership at local, national, and global level. She holds a bachelor's in sociology and master's degree in human rights. Please welcome Ms. Frances Birungi Odong. Right next after her is Mr. Simon Peter Mwesije. Mr. Simon Peter Mwesije is a land tenure advisor with the Global Land Tool Network and UN Habitat. He's currently working as the coordinator of Land at Scale in Uganda project. Simon has more than 10 years professional experience, primarily working as a land tenure specialist, and has a wealth of skills in land administration, land policy reforms, property taxation and valuation from private and government practices in Uganda. He has the experience working at the forefront of global agenda on land tenure involved on specific country-level interventions for FAO, GIZ, and UN Habitat. He holds a master's degree in land management and land tenure from the Technical University of Munich. And yes, please welcome Simon Peter. Last but not least, the people in this setting know Dr. Moses Musinguzi. He's an associate professor of geomatics and land management at Makerere University and a registered land surveyor with over 25 years practical experience in land administration and geographical and land information systems, working as a researcher, consultant, and educationist. He has a PhD in geoinformatics from Uppsala University in Sweden. He has participated in practical land administration processes in Uganda, including developing guidelines and technical specifications for systematic land adjudication and demarcation. He has also played a key role in piloting certification of customary land in Uganda using fit-for-purpose land administration concepts. Please welcome Dr. Moses Musinguzi. It's important that we make these introductions. You never know when you need them. And you also never know, when you need to refer to them. So we have the panel. They are before us. Originally, we thought that the panelists would be able to present and we ask the questions. But we think that for purposes of a dialogue and for purposes of more interaction, we're only going to have one presentation. And the presentation is going to be from Ms. Naomi Kabanda, who's going to be giving us the overall understanding of the national land policy. We felt that it should be a presentation because then it sets the ground for this discussion. At any point that you've not interfaced with discussions around the national land policy, it's just so important that you have the opportunity to understand what the national land policy is about. So please, let's welcome Ms. Naomi Kabanda to give us an overview of the status of the implementation of the national land policy, but also to give us the bigger picture of what the national land policy is and where we are at till now. She has requested to present while seated, so we'll let her do her presentation while seated, and so let us all welcome her to speak to us about the national land policy.
Thank you, John. Maybe you give me the mobile one. It's working. Good afternoon, everyone. Protocol observed. I have already been introduced, and for ease of reference, just call me Madam Kabanda. That will be enough. I'm happy to be part of this dialogue as an implementer, a policymaker, a reformist, an activist, and you can name it. And I've been in the sector for some time now, and I'm happy to report that I'm on the exit end. So I'm going to be giving you an update on the policy in terms of implementation, but more so to point out some of the challenges and the way forward. You know, when you draft policies, it's one thing to have a very good policy on paper, but when it comes to implementation, you need now to examine whether the line you toed, the approach you used, and the process was well examined, and we can use that for future policies, or we can have them reviewed, and in some cases revised. I've been given 15 minutes. So when you are talking about national land policy, this national land policy, we have called it the mother policy. Why? It is the mother of all other policies that feed into the land sector. And therefore, its implementation hinges on many other policies. In that, if we are going to talk about national land policy, it cannot be talked about in its own, segregated right, but you have to look at other policies that link with it and laws. And to be comprehensive, you need something like 2 hours to look at this policy in detail. So I'm just going to do a flash note. The details, they will give you the paper, but there's a full text on Uganda's national land policy. You can Google it, and many experts have implemented the national land policy. They've given their views. And so this is a series of workshops to show how far we have gone in implementation and what could be the learning lessons. So Uganda's national land policy, I hope there's somebody running the, oh. National land policy, we are just going to look at that brief outline, its implementation, status, challenges, and way forward. The national land policy was approved by Cabinet in February 2013, so it's some time back, and it provided a framework for articulating the role of land in national development. Land ownership, distribution, utilization, alienability, management, and control, meaning that everything rotating around land was supposed to be or is supposed to be governed by this policy. It has a very nice vision which says that a transformed Ugandan society through optimal use and management of land resources for a prosperous and industrialized economy with a developed services sector. This vision of the national land policy links directly with NDP3 if you have read it, and other macro instruments that govern Uganda's framework. So if you read that vision, it is the one that now determines what is in that policy, what are the frameworks in that policy, and the implementation status. So this NLP provides that framework, and it gives us an insight, but mark those words: effective land delivery system with the basis for poverty reduction, wealth creation, and socio-economic transformation. You may have heard about those words. When you read our NRM manifesto, because it's a government instrument which we follow, when you read Vision 2040, you all going to get those words, and they are critical, and they have to be examined whether the land sector is performing in that context. Effective, efficient land delivery system, poverty reduction, wealth creation. So the land sector was looked at not to exist per se, but to have it facilitate economic growth and economic development. So when the land sector was approved by Cabinet, we toed the line of implementing it in a phased manner. So it is being implemented in a phased manner, and 2013 it's already made 10 years. So we are going to look at what have we done well in terms of what we set out to do, and then what have been the challenges and maybe the way forward. So our land policy was being implemented in a phased manner. We had what you call immediate actions, short-term actions, and mid-term actions. We did not set out for long-term because this was a policy for 10 years. So like I've already said, it links with these instruments. Oh, sorry. It links with those instruments, and therefore we had to prioritize what is it that we must handle, taking into account that we already had the Land Act. You know, the Land Act came into force in 1998. Usually, you are scholars, policy comes before a law. But in our particular case, Uganda had the law come in place, and the policy comes 10 years after. Because the Land Act was required to be in place by a certain date. After the passing of the Constitution, after the promulgation of the Constitution, there was a deadline set to put the Land Act into place. And they said 2nd July 1998, you must have the Land Act. So they did not allow for policy processes to emerge. They went straight to draft the law. So we are working backwards to see what are the provisions of the law, and then what do we put in the policy. So we had to prioritize. And like I've said, we had immediate actions. I have given a short of what we set out in terms of immediate actions. One of them was to establish the Secretariat to oversee the implementation of the policy. And then we had to establish a multi-sectoral working group. That multi-sectoral working group was intended to coordinate and oversee the reforms. Then the other aspect was we had to disseminate the policy in terms of content for the public, the politicians, and all our stakeholders to understand what is it that is written in this policy. Policies are not approved by Parliament, as you are aware. I hope you are aware that policies in this country are not approved by Parliament. Cabinet decides and approves policies, and after that they are laid on the table of Parliament for information. And therefore you can call this document a document of Cabinet, because Cabinet will sit and discuss it. Once they have agreed, they approve, and then it is laid on the table by Parliament. This is not the same process when you look at countries like Kenya. Kenya, Parliament has to approve the policy, whatever policy it may be. But in our country, it will go to Parliament for information. So we had to disseminate the policy for stakeholder buy-in, for people to understand what are the reforms, and then to see the mandates of the stakeholders who were interested or who were mandated to implement the reforms. Then we did another activity which we called stakeholder mapping exercise. Here we mapped all our actors across the country, whether at national level or at district level or at sub-county level. If you were an actor linked to land or the land sector, you were our stakeholder. And therefore we had to do the geographical mapping exercise to ensure that we cover all the organizations, including non-state, state, religious leaders, and cultural institutions, and even individual academicians. And therefore we had a list of our key stakeholders, and this is a matrix that has helped us all through, because when we did that stakeholder mapping, we ended up with signing of MOUs, memorandums of understanding. If you had an activity, you had to write to the Ministry of Lands showing your interest in the implementation of the National Land Policy, and then we would enter into a formal MOU with you. So those were some of the key actions, immediate, but of course the other one was sensitization and awareness to the technical staff, because they ought also to have known what is in that policy. So in terms of short-term activities, we set out to do an M&E framework, because there is no way you could monitor policy without a framework. So we developed an M&E framework, and it has helped us to assess and evaluate whether the policy has made a difference or it has not made a difference in 10 years. So that M&E framework was developed. So we also went ahead, because gender at that time was a burning issue, to develop the national gender strategy. Uganda is one of the countries that developed a national gender strategy on land to implement the national land policy. And some of our donors, this is the policy when they looked at our policy document and were seeking for support. Once they looked at that, they said, yes, this policy is gender inclusive, and they gave us the funds to implement and develop this strategy. So through that strategy, we have been able to pilot certificates of customary ownership, if you have heard about them. How many of you here in this room have read the Land Act, for example? How many of you have read the Land Act? The Land Act is our Bible. Of course, on top of the Land Act, you have the Constitution. But you cannot talk about land without that act. And therefore, it is used on a daily basis. So it did provide for a number of reforms, and one of them was to issue certificates of customary ownership on customary land, and the other one was to issue certificates of occupancy. Somebody here, I traveled with my lawyer, Emma Mabala, will give you those sections which talk about the section on CCOs and the section on COOs. So those have been very eminent provisions, because government at that time, and especially Parliament, were grappling with Uganda's tenants. How do you deal with them? Lawful and bona fide occupants on land. And yet the Constitution says everyone has a right to land for citizens, and you can hold your land under 4 tenure systems: customary, milo, freehold, and leasehold. And therefore, milo is well known to have multiple land rights. So the Land Act talks about how do you deal with that right for mile owners vis-a-vis the rights of tenants. So when you read that act, it will give you the provisions on how to deal with those areas of law. And therefore, the land policy coming in later addressed that provision of the law, and therefore we started to pilot in different places, both to give out certificates of customary ownership and certificates of occupancy. And we are very mindful. You can see the percentages of women ownership in all our pilots, in all our projects. We are very gender inclusive. You can see those percentages, 40 to 50, showing women ownership. Then there was the need to look at ADR, alternative dispute resolution mechanisms, systems in place because of the case backlogs. And you know that our courts are clogged, and therefore we wanted to look at alternatives. What could be the alternatives for quick settlement of land disputes? So we piloted, we tested a lot of alternative dispute mechanisms. And these mechanisms have assisted us to ensure that we register much more land than if we left all these cases to be handled by courts. So that has been a system established now. Area land committees and elders in different traditional institutions know how to deal with cases under alternative dispute resolution. The other institution that we looked at were institutional reforms, and these ones was to enable efficient, effective land delivery service, which is under our vision. So we had to do a lot in that, and the policy talks about re-engineering land administration. What does that statement mean? That is where you see some of you who have visited our ministries and offices. You can see that we have computerized our land records. We are now having an e-title, and therefore all those reforms are reflected in the activities we have been able to do. So we also took some legal reforms and harmonization of a few things to conform them to the policies. You can see that we did attempt to review all our land laws, a few policies. RTA stands for Registration of Titles Act, have the Survey Act, you have the Land Act itself, the Land Acquisition Act. Those are some of the few acts that we attempted to reform. But under that activity, we made little success. There are a number of challenges we have faced, but legal reform, legal review is one of the hardest components of policy. So we did score less under that area. We have a number of new laws coming up, the Valuation Bill, we have a draft land acquisition resettlement policy, and others which are still pending with us. Some are in draft form, but very little success under legal reforms. On land tenure regularization, I've already talked about that. We've done a number of pilots. Systematic demarcation has been one of our favorite programs, meaning that we have surveyed a lot of parcels and in different districts using fit-for-purpose approaches, but as well as the normal surveying, the traditional survey systems. We've done a lot of work under that area. Many success stories. Under research and studies, we did a lot of studies. I was able to list a few, but the major ones are some on Milo, which are now ongoing. We have new studies on Milo and another study on customary tenure, whether customary tenure should be registered in freehold. There are cases there, or whether customary tenure can be leased. New court cases, so we have done some research under that aspect. And then we have been able to undertake other projects under progress. What have been some of our biggest challenges? Land reforms, I keep repeating, take a long time. You cannot sponsor land reform and you give money for 5 years, 2 years. That is very short time. And therefore, it will depend how much support you get from our development partners. But what you have noted is that land reforms take longer than what usually the donor would define in their agreements. Land is political. All of you are aware. It's a very big political asset, and you need to be careful when you are handling land matters. You have seen some people undress for land, others killing themselves for land. So when you are doing land reforms, you need to be very careful on how you handle land matters, how you get communities mobilized, and how the politicians are also handled. Because if you don't handle them properly, you will not have a successful land reform. You have the legal regulatory. I've spoken. It's one of our biggest challenges. We got consultants, tried to interpret or make the Registration of Titles Act simpler, but we failed. So it's a giant animal, the RTA, and yet it has to be revised because many things have changed. Then harmonization of sectoral laws and policies. It has been slow. I know that some sectors, like I said at the beginning, which directly link with the land sector, have revised their policies, have revised their laws. So there's a lot of harmonization that is happening, but some of it is slow because laws take a little bit of a longer time. Research and studies, I've talked about that. Then the other area is conducive environment. If you don't have a conducive environment, you cannot touch land matters. When, for example, it's an electoral season, the president will always say, don't touch land, don't bring land. It will bring confusion, people will raise their tempers, and so we always have to work when government is stable. What have been our learning lessons? A few of them, I've pointed them out. We need to create a think tank, a team of experts to analyze, evaluate the processes and reforms. So we did some mid-term review to see whether what we had set out to do, the processes, the challenges, could be evaluated, and we change what was not working. And so you need that think tank to be there full time to think through these processes. according to the changing environment. Then you need to create a multi-stakeholder platform to assess success, gaps, and also make proposals of future reforms. We are reviewing the land policy, I've told you, after the 10 years, and we have already set out to create these new platforms so that they can give us success stories and gaps, and probably to work together in the next 10 years. What can be our priorities as we go along in the next 10 years? And here you have to use everyone. We went back to our mapping matrix to see who are our critical key stakeholders, and then they are able to give us that kind of information. The ministry can't work alone. So we need carefully to be reminded of our roles. You know, when you are implementing the national land policy, you sometimes get confused. Why? Some people's mandates are derived from the national land policy, while the environment also keeps changing. Like now, climate change is the thing. When you look at the policy, it's very silent on climate change. So you need that team to give you a focus. Where are the gaps? What could be the future areas of study? Then the capacity continuous building of capacity of the staff, so that they don't get lost, they don't lose the zeal. And also the civil society. They can get along with you but drop off. So you need to energize them so that they continue to do the work. Remember, most of this work is voluntary. Government does not pay. But we have to energize ourselves, and we continue the process. Good political support, I've talked about that. And then the donor support. After COVID, we realized that there's been a drop in donor support for some of our activities, and with the signing of this new law, we are still losing more, and so we need to be steady on what are we going to implement. How is government going to generate revenue locally to be able to implement these reforms when the donor support is not forthcoming? Then we need to realize that different actors have different interests. So you may not want to serve everyone's interests. You need to remain focused. So we have an implementation action plan, and we are going to write a new one so that we streamline all our activities in that implementation action plan. The policy, when it is reviewed, it will give us the bigger strategic objectives. But we still need to come out with an implementation action plan so that we are able to assess our performance with clear indicators. Now, we need to continuously build consensus among all our stakeholders. I had given what we are going to do in the next few weeks of ongoing work. I've told you the policy is under review. It made 10 years. We are soon holding our platform to hear the success stories, the challenges, the gaps, and we write the new policy. Then we have to showcase on what we have learned. And I hope, if all goes well, we shall have the next policy probably next year for the next 10 years and submit it to Cabinet for approval. I guess we have to do this when the political environment is still good, before 2025. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Madam Kavanda. Thanks for the overview of the National Land Policy and for the extensive display of the challenge that we are having, the challenges that you're facing, but also what you're looking at as how to move from here. You outlined a number of laws that you want to see be passed. This has taken quite a while now, and it's affecting the country in many ways. But we're hoping that this is something that will be addressed. I wouldn't want to have a panel discussion, not a discussion from the people listening in now. I would want to first indulge the panelists that we have. Francis, one of the things that Madame Kabanda speaks about is the gender strategy in the national land policy. One of the things that also comes out clearly as she talks about the gender strategy is the issue of percentage of women owning land. She talks about a figure of 40 to 50% of women owning land. And also, she talks about the areas where they are supporting women and children with regard to areas dealing with land. One of the issue we have, and being in an academic institution, is the figures. 40 to 50%, 20 to 27, 15, 10, all these are the figures. Can we say that the national land policy has given us that major stride in ensuring that women own land? Please speak to the whole issue of women and land with regard to the national land policy.
Thank you so much, Mwebe. And I've been introduced, but you can call me Frances. So in response to your question, I think, as has been presented by Madame Naomi, the national land policy really is a very gender-responsive document. If you look at the content and the provisions within the national land policy, it's very clear that the policy in itself is a very gender-sensitive and transformative document that, if implemented, a lot of issues would be catered for. And when we look at the different provisions that we have in the national land policy, in regard to women's land rights and in regard to the rights of vulnerable groups like children, like people with disability, and so forth, we see that the national land policy is very clear on redressing some of those historical and cultural injustices that discriminate women and those marginalized groups from having, equal opportunities and equal access to land. So from the start, the policy in itself really presents itself as an instrument that ensures that men and women and people with marginalized groups are able to enjoy their land rights. Also, when you look at the other provisions of the policy, it talks about equity in access to the land, regardless of gender, sex, and all other differences that human beings may have. It also talks about issues around equal participation in land governance, so providing opportunities for women and for marginalized groups to equally participate in land processes. And also, it also emphasizes the issue around education and awareness around the rights for women and for marginalized groups in regard to their ability to access, to own, and to control land. So just the national land policy as it is a very gender progressive, because the provisions are very strong in regard to how women's land rights and the rights of marginalized people can be promoted. And Madame Naomi also mentioned the national gender strategy that you talked about. And I think, for me, that even made it stronger. In itself, as an instrument, it was a strong instrument in regards to promoting women's land rights and rights of marginalized groups. But the fact that from the start there was a strategy, a gender strategy, that really clearly provides guidelines on how to actualize the provisions in the national land policy, I think that is very powerful. And as she mentioned, it has been one of those actions that have made it the national land policy very successful in terms of the achievements that he mentioned, because the guidelines are very clear, the strategies are very clear on how we can actualize the provisions within the national land policy in regard to promoting the rights of women and marginalized groups. For example, it talks about, it provides very clearly around issues to do on participation of women. And we see that currently our laws provide for 1/3 representation of women. So that is something, at least it's very clear, and it's a guideline that we have in our structures, in our land structures from the local level, that women have to be part of these processes, of the decision-making processes. But even beyond just the governance or the management of the land, even in the conversations, you see that spaces are opened at all levels to ensure that women and marginalized groups, the youth, the children, that they are part of these conversations, because there is a strategy that clearly tells us how we can be able to achieve some of these things. And another aspect that I can also mention about one of the achievements that we've had in regard to having a gender strategy is around having a very gender responsive and inclusive and participatory process that ensure that both men and women, girls and boys are able to have secure land rights. So when you look at the guidelines in the strategy, it clearly provides guidelines on how that can happen. How do we have women, men, boys, girls have secure land rights? For example, in the land registration process, it clearly shows what are those things that we have to look at as practitioners or as people that are doing land registration to ensure that both men and women, girls and boys are able to participate and benefit from these processes. For example, it provides for joint titling, especially on customary land. So the CCOs that she's talking about, the ones that we have currently, you will see that women are actually the majority of people that are registered as landowners. Girls, because it's something that practitioners know they must do. If they don't do that, then it is not adhering to the principles of equality, of gender equality. There are issues around education and awareness. You cannot do land registration, you cannot provide CCOs if you have not interacted with communities, if you have not had conversations with them about their rights, the opportunities that exist. And because this is clearly stipulated in the strategy, we find that many practitioners on ground working on land registration are following those principles and making sure that they are able to have these conversations at community level and making people aware of the rights that they have and how they can also participate in this process. And this takes us away from the traditional ways of, for example, surveying, where some questions are not asked. For example, are you married? Do you have children? Do you have girl children? Those are some questions that in the policy and in the gender strategy, it's very clear that those questions have to be asked in the land registration process and many other guidelines that exist in terms of engendering the land registration process on all tenure systems. And then I also want to talk about issue to do with the alternative dispute resolution, access to justice for women. It is also an achievement that we have seen in the national land policy, in the sense that the national land policy provides alternatives. It provides a legal pluralism, which allows other forms of justice systems to operate. It allows the formal justice system, the court system, but also the informal systems, the traditional systems, the cultural systems. It also allows for the alternative dispute resolution, like the mediation. Now, that is very critical for women, and it's very critical for marginalized groups, because we know that most of them cannot afford the formal, or the processes of the formal systems are very complex for many of these, especially at the grassroots level, to be able to access justice in a way that they should be able to access. So the fact that the national land policy and the strategy provides for these alternatives is a plus for women and marginalized groups. I will also talk about the fact that the policy talks about gender equitable inheritance. And that is very critical, because we know that because of our customs, because of our laws, especially the traditional or the cultural laws and norms that we have, the inheritance processes leave out women, leave out girls. And the fact that we have a policy and we have a strategy that clearly stipulates that in the inheritance processes, women and girls should be given equal opportunity to inherit. And because of that guidance, we have seen some of these amendments happening in the Succession Act. Like we have the Succession Amendment Act 2022, which clearly is making sure that women and girls are given equal opportunity as boys to be able to inherit. And if this was not clearly stipulated, then that wouldn't have been taken into consideration in the amendment process. I would also probably talk about the issue around education and awareness. Again, that is an area that is has been an achievement, a very big achievement because of the kind of national land policy that we have and the strategy, which emphasizes education and awareness on women's land rights, not only for women, but for communities to know that women and girls have rights, that marginalized groups have rights on land, equal rights. And this really helps communities as they try to, to work around these rights, but also for the women themselves and the marginalized groups to be able to assert and claim these rights when these rights are violated. Because they know they are empowered by the law, they know that they have these rights, so they are able to claim these rights. So in a nutshell, I'll just say that there's been a lot that has been done by practitioners, a lot in terms of implementing the national land policy, guided by the gender strategy on land, and this has really helped women, girls, marginalized groups in their different categories to also enjoy their rights as equal human beings in this country. So there's a lot of achievement that has happened, but there are a number of challenges that still exist that can, we can have a discussion around later.
Well, thank you so much, Francis, for that. Later in the discussions, you'll share with us any experience you've had in the community with regard to how you've registered land within traditional settings, within, especially on land that's customarily held, because then we have this whole discussion of the patriarchy, it's the man who owns the land and that kind of registration. So it's something that you would share with us at any point. It can even be a story or a sentence or a quote. I would briefly skip to Dr. Msinguzi, and the reason I'm skipping to Dr. Msinguzi is I would want to piggyback on what Francis has said. In her address, she said that from the traditional ways, and in this building, I believe your traditional way of registration of land is entirely the formal. The surveyor has to bring, for us in our world, we call it machines. He has to bring machines. You know how you call those. She also talks about the bit of affordability. She talks about the bit of women and children with regard to owning land. She talks about all these things, and all of them speak to the formal ways of registering land using your torrent system. But there's the flip side of it, the one you call the fit for purpose, the one where we want to have accommodation of those that may not fit this billing. How is this catered for in the national land policy? How do we see it manifest in the aspirations of the national land policy, and especially now going forward into the national land policy 2? So how do we see the aspirations of the people be fixed under the fit for purpose?
Thank you very much, moderator, and the participants. I will answer to your question, but maybe let me give a short background also on the national land policy. A national land policy is just a policy like other government policies. And a good policy normally has identified the issues or the major intervention areas. If you do a very good inventory of the intervention areas, I think that is good justice for a policy. Then number 2, you should provide good solutions to those intervention areas. Then number 3, there must be consensus. You need to build consensus among all the stakeholders that the solutions that you have provided are very good for those problems. And in terms of that, I can very well say, and my colleagues have also said, that we have a very good national land policy. If you compare with other countries, you can actually tell that we have a very good land policy. Now, the 2 questions which will lead also to my submission. 1, first of all, do the key players who are supposed to implement this policy understand it? Because we have a number of key stakeholders, and the Ministry of Lands, Housing and Urban Development is the major key stakeholder. We have land administrators, we have registrars, we have land surveyors, so many stakeholders. Now, when every one of these officers is performing their duties, are they actually focusing on the goals of the land policy? Do they understand that actually there are certain targets that we must achieve as a country in regard to the national land policy? Even including a driver who is driving an officer to the field, does this driver really understand what he or she is contributing toward the national land policy? If the answer is yes, then we can say we are better positioned to actually achieve the goals of the national land policy. But if the answer is no, then definitely we must have a lot of challenges in meeting the targets of the national land policy. Then the second question is, how fast can we achieve the goals of the national land policy? Because you can have a policy, you have strategies, but then you never achieve them. You must have a time frame in which to achieve these policies. I will give you a quote which I can read to you by Eric Hoffer, who is an American philosopher, and he said, in times of change, learners inherit the earth, while the land find themselves beautifully equipped to deal with a world that no longer exists. So, here, we have a problem, and the policy is supposed to address the land problem. But now, we keep on building very beautiful solutions. But finally, you find actually that the problem for which you're developing the solution has really surpassed your capacity even to deal with it. Just like you can have a patient who is an emergency case, and you take this patient to the hospital. Normally, each hospital has emergency, and that's why they have an emergency. Now you have a very good doctor who is going to look for very good gloves, very good equipment. But now you spend 2 hours and the patient dies. So you have no patient to look after. So now, to me, even if we have a very good land policy, we must look at the time frame in which we can achieve the objectives of this land policy. Now, what is fit for purpose land administration? Fit for purpose land administration is an approach, a new approach to land administration, whereby you look at what you are doing and then you look for the solution. A solution that is fit for purpose has got 3 elements that I'm going to list down. First of all, what is the purpose? What is the purpose for which I'm doing this? So here, you do as little as possible and as much as necessary, which means you don't do extra. You just do what is necessary as long as it achieves the purpose. I've given an example before. You are coming here. You don't have to come in a bus because the bus will bring you here. You can come in a small car or a border because the purpose is reaching here. So you use the least that you can do to arrive here. Then the second one is flexibility. Be as flexible as possible. Here, you have standards. You can say, I want to set very high standards. But be very flexible with those standards as long as you are achieving the purpose. And finally, incremental improvement. Do what you can afford as long as it can help you achieve the purpose, but then later on, when your situation becomes better, then you can improve higher to get something better than you have. So, when you apply this in the land administration, we've been having a problem. And this problem is that we have land in Uganda, and we have so many people who are tenure insecure. We have a lot of land conflicts going on. And actually, I would say, if we have the land policy, and one of the priorities is not addressing the tenure insecurity problems, I think we shall really not be doing justice to the problems in this country. There is the Pareto 80-20 rule, which states that actually, if you do 20%, in many situations, 20% of the solutions will cause 80% of the outcomes. So, if you address the problem of tenure insecurity, possibly you have addressed 80% of what the land policy is intended to achieve. So, I was doing an estimation and looked at the way we have been managing our tenure security. Land registration in Uganda came at the beginning of the last century, about 1900, and we've been grappling with land registration, but up to now we are talking between 20 and 30% of the land that has been secured. And we are using very complicated techniques, as the moderator has informed us. Land registration was brought here by the British, but the British in their country, they actually never used the methods that they are telling us to use. So why should we be stuck with those methods? What is our purpose? If you are in the Lands and Survey Department and you have an equipment and you are surveying and people are getting titles, what is the overall purpose? Is the overall purpose just to keep on surveying, or the overall purpose is to make sure that as many people as possible get titles? So how can we improve the techniques so that they are affordable and as many people as possible are able to secure their land rights? Let's go on Mairo. We are always, actually, most of the statistics on the proportion of registered land are on Mairo because the whole of Uganda is registered, and that is about 20% of the country. But also in Uganda, on the Mairo, who is registered? The one who is registered is the Mairo owner. But you know that about 70% of the people on Mairo are Bibanja holders, and their tenure is insecure. So essentially, we are not even talking about 20-30%. We are talking about between 8 maybe and 10% of tenure security. So now, if you are saying we must continue using these sophisticated procedures, and we are going to take 400 years to complete the entire country, are you really focusing on the national land policy? Are you focusing on solving the problems of land contributing to national development? Two, when you go to land registration, the processes in sub-Saharan Africa, I think on average, you take about 40 days to do a transaction in the land registry. In Uganda, I think I may also have to get the statistics. Although I know there have been steps to reduce the steps, but the steps are still very many. Every time you hear that the registrar has issued additional steps, you must present when you are going to to transfer, you must appear physically, you must give notice, you must swear an affidavit. You are making it very complicated. So you need to find out what is the purpose of what I'm doing. And if people follow this, how long are they going to take? We have very good case studies, by the way, in improving service delivery in government. Recently, I went to renew my permit in the Ministry of Works. And I was used to going there, you leave your documents, and then you spend maybe another 1 month. But when I reached there, they told me, no, you sit there. I sat in the queue where as many as we are here. And we kept on moving. After 1 hour, I went with my permit. That is fit for purpose. And we can achieve it even within the land, in the land administration. But how can we do that? It means we must be able to do away with the complicated procedures. So, Mr. Moderator, allow me to stop here, and I think I'll add later on when I'm invited. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Msinguzi. I have one question. It's a yes or no. Is the fit for purpose element a part of what you lecture your students in?
Yes, we lecture fit for purpose here.
Thank you. Thank you. And maybe for purposes of, we have a land officer in our midst. We need to know if we have to swear an affidavit, if we have to transfer the titles. He's the land officer for Mitiana. Please welcome. So thank you so much, Dr. Msinguzi. Simon Peter, UN Habitat has done a tremendous role in supporting the national land policy in its entirety, from the gender strategy, other strategies, but also from the aspect of the tools. Now, when I talk about tools in our setting, the people here will understand tools because they're coming from a science background. If it were faculties down south, would have quite a challenge. So now, let us talk about the support from UN Habitat, but also let us talk about the tools that have come into place to be able to help with the registration of land. Over to you, Simon.
Thank you very much, John. I'm pleased to represent UN Habitat and the Global Land Tool Network in this dialogue. I've already been introduced. I would like to, first of all, also affirm that within the development partners community, and actually globally, because we work in many countries, so we have an overview of what's happening elsewhere. Uganda land policy stands out as one of the good policies. And this is mainly because of one, the policy was developed through a very long process of consultation. So a lot of stakeholders were involved. Consensus was very critical. And it is widely in Uganda acknowledged as our land development framework. So that's the first point. The second point is that the national land policy, as already pointed out, addresses very well issues to do with inclusion. So here we are talking about women land rights, which Frances already talked about, land rights of ethnic minorities, children, and other vulnerable groups. So this is one of the reasons why the national land policy is acknowledged globally as one of the good policies. The third reason is that the policy, rather than introduce a new system, looks at what is existing and identifies clear strategies of how to improve. And this, from our experience, works better than introducing a new system altogether. I mean, you might already be aware that where development partners supported interventions, for instance, in sub-Saharan Africa, to get rid of customary land tenure systems in favor of freehold and individual titling, it failed miserably. So the idea underlying our national land policy to look at what is existing and identifying entry points for improvement is excellent. And that's one of the reasons why the national land policy of Uganda stands out. The third reason is that because of what I said before, the policy is also based on international best practices and approaches that are recommended. For instance, it's based on and supports the continuum of land rights approach. It also conforms, as already discussed by Professor, to the key principles of the fit-for-purpose land administration, as well as the voluntary guidelines principles. So So we have a very good policy, and because of this, within the development partners community, we have agreed since 2016, when we established a development partners working group, that the national land policy becomes our key framework for supporting government in the land sector. So the policy in that sense has been really very instrumental for engagements between government and civil society partners with development partners. And when you look at most of the interventions that are supported by development partners within the last 10 years of the land policy existence, you will see that they are really hinged on the national land policy as well as the land law. Now, as UN Habitat and the Global Land Tool Network, within the UN system, the UN Habitat is charged for coordinating governments to implement Sustainable Development Goal 11, which is about sustainable cities and communities. So that is our entry point as UN Habitat, to support the government of Uganda to implement the national land policy, because of the recognition that it is going to be very difficult to achieve sustainable cities, looking at the high urbanization rate in Uganda, but as well as sustainable communities, whether it is in urban and rural areas, without addressing the question of land. So the question of land, therefore, becomes an important part of our work. But as the Global Land Tool Network, which is facilitated by UN Habitat, the Global Land Tool Network is a network of more than 80 partners, global partners, working to address land issues globally, regionally, and nationally. So through the Global Land Tool Network, the partners have developed many tools, land tools. And these tools address different land management and land administration areas. So we have tools such as Propua land information systems, precisely because of what Professor was explaining, that we must make land services more affordable and accessible for all, including the urban and the rural poor. We have tools that address issues of inclusion, such as the gender evaluation criteria and youth. We have tools that are looking at how do we support government, especially local government, to raise revenue from land. So land is a source of revenue through taxation. We have tools that also address issues to do with planning, but we are looking at 10-year responsive land use planning, so that the land use planning has to be promoting land tenure security, because you can do land use planning which can result into eviction of people, and in that case you negatively affect people's land tenure. So we have developed more than 25 tools. They are at different levels of development. Some of them have been piloted and implemented in Uganda in the context of supporting the implementation of the national land policy. And so, John, this has been our main entry point to support the national land policy. We were one of the early arrivals as development partners to work with government since 2013, And we have achieved a number of milestones, some of which the director has already enumerated. I'll stop here for now and happy to continue later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Simon. In the latest buzz in the corridors of power is around suspension of support from development partners, especially with regard to that law. Is it a point we get you holding a Bible and you commit to still standing with us, or you still are committing to standing with this country?
Thank you, John. I'm very sure you know that that question is above me. But what I can say is that the United Nations system has put out a statement, it's public, on this. But at the same time, we recognize that the UN work supports, the UN work touches many vulnerable communities. So my 50 cents on this is that the UN system will continue to work and support the government of Uganda in all areas, including land. At the same time, finding other solutions to resolve the human rights concerns.
Thank you, Simon. It's an interesting way of going around it. Maybe to Madame Kabanda, we know that there's a whole project or program called SEDEP, supported by the World Bank. Where does it stand? You may not have to respond to that. Okay. Thank you so much, my panelists, Madame Naomi Kabanda, Ms. Francis Odong, Mr. Mesije, Simon Peter, and Dr. Msinguzi. I open the floor to the discussion. We agreed that you put up your hand and you'd let us know your name. Any other detail you may want to give us, we're open to have it. And then you have your comment or question. Let us make it brief, because then we would want as many of you to ask or to make your comments. Thank you. Can we put up our hands so that we can pick the first 5, 6, or 10? Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. There's 4 that side. 5, 6, 7, 8. So let's go with the first 8. 9. So if your hand will
I'll begin by highlighting just the simple fact that the land policy is a big document. It addresses a number of issues. Some of them we have spoken about them, but some of them we may not have spoken about them. 2 is that I will go by the vision. A transformed Ugandan society through optimal use of land resources for a prosperous and industrialized economy with a developed service sector. I've always been wondering, how do you achieve this? With the following questions. Land delivery mechanisms in Uganda are still very hard. It is very hard to acquire land or to easily get land in Uganda, especially if you are looking at big land within an urban area. Land is very fragmented, and the fragmentation continues day by day. The question is, if you had an investor that wants 2 acres, 3 acres within the city center or within the nearby city center, how do you allow that, or how is that possible? How is the policy channeled to allow investors acquire land in Uganda, especially when you're acquiring big land? The second question is that, or the second observation is that we still have a challenge in Uganda. Land is not viewed as a factor of production. Why? Is that people look at land as something they should own, pass on to children, but not something that is transactable as a source of capital and that can be used to deliver capital or to deliver production. So how does the policy address itself to the fact that land needs to be viewed as a factor of production, purposes of economic delivery? Third one is the issue of land fragmentation.
And lastly?
Yes, I'm going to conclude. the issue of land fragmentation, but also the issue of horizontal urbanization rather than vertical urbanization. We are spreading horizontally and not growing vertical as a what? Yet land is restricted, but the population keeps on increasing. How does the policy address solve some of these issues? Probably the last one, Chair, is the issue of land taxation. The policy talked about the possibility of land taxation after research has been done on it. This is something that has not entirely been done, I think, in the last 10 years, and there's seemingly no discussion about land taxation. Taxation is used as a regulatory policy. Where land is not being utilized, it is delivered to another person who can use it. But currently where we are, without taxation of land, people can hold land and don't use it at all for the next 10 or 20 or 30 years. How is the policy being able to address some of these issues? Thank you very much.
Okay, second.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I'm called Mahulo David. I'm a lawyer and a practicing one. Now, just a brief observation of the, first of all, I'm very grateful for this, the panelists. And my observation on the land policies is not very elaborate, it's a bit inadequate. Practically, we have a lot of problems which I would admire that this land policy addresses. But in practice, it's like, actually when we practice, like the land policy is non-existing when we go to courts. First of all, this habit of land encroachment, could it be caused by the land policy not emphasizing land use or sensitizing people on land use? Because when there are some lands which are reserved for forests, swamps, and what have you, but now I'm told Uganda has about 80% remaining of the natural, of our natural environment, land which is public land. There's a lot of encroachment on anything called public land. Now, even me, right, before I got aware, I think public land is like nobody's land. I come from a place where land is not titled. So when you got the swamp and cultivate there, they praise you for being strong. You can only live by yourself. You can even settle there if you want. They even laugh at you for settling there. You are lonely. There's nothing like government coming and evicting you or telling you not to go there. You just go there ignorantly, stay there, and even live willingly, ignorantly at the same time. So there is need for sensitization. I pity women. When you go to court, really women are in trouble.
In one more minute?
Yes?
Yeah.
Land for women has been taken by force. It is even worse, women who don't have a husband, say widows, very vulnerable. Now you have seen recently there was a woman who was even attacked and killed with her husband in Mubende. Now, I think the biggest problem is sensitization. People of the land police, surveyors are just being killed. In that place where the woman was killed with her husband, earlier on, that was the third episode of killing. Earlier on, a land surveyor was just killed and burnt. Killed, brought back to his car and burnt. And people, and life goes on. Now, we are very, lastly, let me still on the issue of women. As Buganda is the biggest culprit, paternal society, where they don't even believe in women taking, inheriting land. It is worse in our communal land ownership there. Omukazi aja kutunda ettaka agenda afumbirwa walala. And that's it hits the men very hard. So even our judges tell us, if you allow these women of yours to own land, they will descend and abandon you. And it happens at times. It can be very desperate. But lastly, let's educate people on making wills. There's a lot of trouble. If you have people to take over land, the only way you can bring in your girls into your land, make a will. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Elijah Basaza. I'm a land surveyor. My observation is on the certificates of customary ownership. There is a situation whereby someone being given customary ownership certificate, they go ahead and acquire the certificate of title, let's say freehold, that's in the villages. So my issue is, why would someone, after acquiring the customary ownership certificate, go ahead and acquire a land title? Is it because maybe they don't know that this is actually a legal document as well? And why isn't it, why does the LIS not capture the certificate of customary ownership? Thank you very much.
Thank you. I would request that if you're asking and you have an acronym, please say it in full. LIS and all these other acronyms for purposes of everyone in the room.
It's the National Land Information System.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm called Ispiga Prosperous. I'm the district staff surveyor for Kawale. Mine is about stamp duty. While assessing the stamp duties, some areas are not having the values. So you find a valuer who is at the MZO, at the mercy of his valuations. Some valuers have not built, they are just from school. Find someone, you have a 3-bedroom house, the girl or the boy or the valuer or the officer is valuing 500 million. Some use it because they want to negotiate, say maybe give me this much so that I reduce for you. So sometimes you need to make these values for some areas very accessible to the public. More so, we are talking about developing physical development plans. But you find some areas have no plans, they especially are planning loads. These loads you find, if you are to pass through someone's plot, you must, because they see the National Loads Authority, they are compensating. So everyone is eyeing, whenever they want to pass something through my plot, there must be compensation. So it is from this background that I may call upon government. If at all, if we are to have well-developed countries or cities, we must think about a planning authority whereby we could maybe compulsory acquire some pieces of land, plan it, like have like an estate, then afterwards we sell back to the public, and government would also make a good amount of money from that business. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We also had an acronym called MZOS.
Thank you. My name's Andagira Maria Joanita, a land surveyor by profession, currently working on a land project, responsible land policy in Uganda. Thank you to the panelists for your submissions. I have 2 submissions to make. One of them, Madam Kabanda mentioned, one of the actions of the land policy is dissemination to all stakeholders, the land service deliverers, the land officers, people meant to implement it. I think I add my voice to Professor Moses when I ask, how well do these people know the policy? Do they understand it? And also, what avenues are there to disseminate the land policy and other instruments to the general public, because those are the users of the law. My second submission is about the costing for the fit for purpose land administration. Of course, through different projects, it has been possible, but what is the sustainability of that through costing? If someone, say someone that wants to get a certificate of customary ownership, were to ask what is the cost attached to the entire process, is that information available? Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Kaluba Peter, a graduate land surveyor. I will have 2 submissions to put across. The first one, there is this essence of having a lot of land.
You realize that we have the noise coming from that side, so please be a bit more audible.
Okay. There is essence of one person owning land, a lot of land, as an individual. This can cause some land to be dormant, yet some, like the government can be in need of it to be maybe to do forestry. So how is the land policy addressing that? This can lead to, it can even create tax. For example, if one individual is having a lot of land, we can put that maybe if someone owns a square mile and beyond, can start paying tax to the government. So that we limit, some land is dominant, it can be used by. So the second is organization, organized distribution of land. For example, there are some districts where a lot of people converge in one place. So can the land policy distribute these people, for example? Organize these people that all their houses are along the road, then at the backyard, that land can be used for farming, so that people don't be sparsed in a disorganized manner. Yeah, I don't know whether that is understood.
Clearly, yes. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Apollo Ampumwize. I'm a land surveyor. And I want to begin by thanking all the panelists for the excellent submission and exposure about the national land policy. Now, my question goes to, actually my concern goes to the submission made by Dr. Musinguzi about the fit for purpose. It's indeed an excellent program that addresses very many key issues. And like you rightly said in your submission, we have so many of such programs that are very good but are not well implemented, hence not achieving the purpose. So my question is, what strategies have been made or are in place to ensure that this program gets strategically laid out all over the country, especially to the key stakeholders? We have the local government, we have the surveyors, in all over the country, because I've been hearing it in the corridors for quite a while, but it's not being rolled out. So what are the strategic efforts to ensure that this one does not follow the other very good programs that keep disappearing in the corridors along the way? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm Adinito Innocent, a student here now going in year 3, a surveyor. And I have 2 questions, and one of them, according to the gender strategy, you realize that most of these issues of women, of the minor groups, are considered, they are cultural. I don't know when in this land policy that we are implementing, have you consulted those cultural leaders, also put that gender strategy in their reforms and their solutions? Then another question is, where Professor Musinguzi said maybe in the Ministry of Works there is fit for purpose, but then in the Ministry of Lands, because I'm an intern, I've not seen it, because last time we went to survey someone, they told us to obtain a title, you have to spend more than 6 months, because you have to move around, you have to meet the planning, you have to meet what. I don't know, I think this national land policy should ease out the work so that most of lands, they be surveyed. Those were my submissions.
Thank you. As people grab land, Mr. Musinguzi grabbed the microphone. So this side had only 3 people, and there's still someone here. Okay.
Thank you, the panelist. My name is Buer Ronald, a student here. I've been listening tentatively, and in my analysis, 10 years down the road, the land policy implementation maybe has been achieved or not, but in my analysis, I think the land policy is a very good document However, we have the land laws, other land laws, which the land policy must complement. Those are very static documents that have not been revised of late. For example, we have the Registration of Titles Act, which is very old. We have the Survey Act, which is very rigid, that even doesn't allow fit for purpose. The way the surveyors should submit their work, the method of field work, everything does not allow innovations of technology, and even the institutional framework was not revised to make services available to the people. So the land policy is a good document, but it has not been centralized down where the land services are needed. And also the land laws are still very static and has not helped to solve the land question. Thank you.
Thank you so much. For all the years I've listened to people speak about land, they've talked about the land question. I don't know when that will be sorted.
Thank you so much, the panelists, Madam Kayondo, Mr. Mwesije, Professor Musinguzi, and Mrs. Francis. My name is Priscilla Ahisibwe. I'm a final year student at Chambogo University, and I'm the former student representative ISU. So my final research project is assessing the impact of land tenure on implementation of physical planning. So Mr. Mwesije talked about using the Global Land Tool Network, tenure responsive land use planning, and I wanted to address my question and ask if it is being implemented in the land policy. Because in my research, I'm going to look at different tenures and how physical planning is prospering. And I've tried to read in the land policy, and tenure responsive land use planning is not being adopted so much. And this can cause wrangles and land issues. Yeah, so that's my question.
Thank you. I thought at the end you'd also thank the facilitator.
Thank you so much. My name is Robert Semwanga. I'm a land surveyor. My question is simple. I heard that some of the interventions that are being done in the Fit for Purpose Area 1 for customary tenure, they are trying to process certificates of customary occupancy for the different people occupying customary land. Then on Maido land, they are creating certificates of occupancy for the tenants on Maido land. My question is, where is the register for the customary certificates of occupancy for customary land? Because you may find that someone has a customary certificate, but in case I wanted to go and maybe make a search, if maybe there is any transaction that is to take place on customary land and someone has a CCO, where will I access the information about that land? Then two, how is the COO, that is the customary, the certificate of occupancy on Maido land reflected on the NLIS, that if a landlord has a title of 200 acres and it has so many squatters and they have processed for them COOs, and someone somewhere wants to buy that piece of land, you know, our system, the torrent system, they are talking of the mirror principle. That if I go to the land office and make a search, whichever information they give me is the true information. That can be misleading, because if this information, the COO, is not captured on the NLIS, someone is going to end up buying encumbered land, yet there are people who own CCOs that are not reflected on the system. I'm wondering if that has already been worked on. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm grateful to be here. Thank you for giving us your time. My name is Flavia Navakoza. I'm a registrar of titles, and I have a question for Madame Francis. You say that the policy has very good provisions for securing women's rights. However, the issue still
Thank you very much. I'll be the last person. My question is in regards with his there about the incorporation of the CCOs and COOs into the land information system. What strategies have been laid? And then for the youth, I'll ask for them. What is being done to bring the youth on board into the fit for purpose as well as into the land policy? Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the questions. And we are going to ask our panelists to respond to the questions. We'll ask Madame Kabanda to be the first to respond because many are institutional questions. And then we'll have in the line, Francis, Peter, and Dr. Oh, okay. We also have some issues online. So George Harmony is asking that most practitioners are money-oriented. They're not focusing on impact of their services towards achieving goals of national land policy. Okay, that's a comment. And I see that's a snide attack at surveyors. David Kugonza, how do we deal with complicated procedures in acquiring land titles? That will go to Madame Naomi. Osbert Kamkama, how has the land policy considered land tenure for pastoralists and nomadic communities, and what efforts have been made to accommodate their unique needs, the pastoralism and land ownership? Still David Kugoza, how does a community benefit from brownfield redevelopment in rural areas? A good national land policy should be able to identify intervention areas and address the challenges, but also have the consent of all the stakeholders. Thank you so much, the participants who are online. Thank you for following through the discussion. And we ask that you keep sending through the questions and the comments. We'll be reading them as and when they come through. So, Madame Kabanda, we can start with you.
Thank you so much for those questions and observations, and I'm glad that I could see you were listening. The land policy indeed is a very big document, like you rightly observed. And like I said, it has been with us for the last 10 years, from 2013. Maybe some of you may have been at that level. Either you were in senior 2, senior 4. Some of you had started practice, and others were not following these issues. But it's a big document, and like I said in my highlights, we did a lot of work to disseminate content at the beginning. Actually, a lot of funds went into dissemination workshops. And we did this in segmented manner, like I told you. We facilitated workshops with technical people in different fields, surveyors, lawyers, valuers, just on content, so that people could understand, both in government and private practice, cultural leaders, name it. We got a lot of funds around sensitization and dissemination of the policy. And probably that's why when we did a 5-year review, midterm review, the biggest activity where we had made success was on dissemination. We printed copies, and actually this could also be shown when civil society now had started implementing the policy even without us. You could see that all their mandates were hinging on the national land policy. So that was a good indicator that many civil society organizations and agencies of government had picked on the policy. We are yet to measure the success of this dissemination process, because I've told you that we are under review. A study is being conducted to assess the impact or effectiveness or success of this implementation process for the last 10 years. So we shall get to the platform, and the study will inform us whether we scored or we didn't make any progress only in that aspect of sensitization, awareness creation. Notes that we have been implementing the policy in a phased manner. Some of the programs were for immediate, others were for short term, and then medium term activities. So depending on the complexity of the activity, you can mark and say maybe we got 40%, 20%, but I highlighted the biggest challenge was on legal review. The rest we have scored because the results can speak for themselves. A lot of work has been done, for example, on systematic demarcation, different districts. Many stakeholders have benefited, communities have benefited. But the area of legal reform, that is the review of our laws, we made very little success. And I'm happy that one of you pointed out that the Survey Act is very old, rigid, does not even talk about FFP, does not talk about fit for purpose methods, and it requires comprehensive review. So what we have done is to look at all these laws. I know that they are in advanced stages, some are midway, others we have not started up to now. Like the RTA, we had put in place a certain consultant to look at the review of the RTA. You know, the RTA, the Registration of Titles Act, has both the act itself plus the procedures. They are all together. It's not like the Land Act where you have the act and then the regulations. The regulations for the RTA are attached in the act itself. So you find that it becomes complex when it is defining certain aspects of registration. And so the Department of Land Registration, having realized that they couldn't break through to have that act reviewed, they have gone back and set up committees to look at the RTA in its entirety. The Land Act, of course, is one of the acts that has been revised several times, and it is still on the table of Cabinet to be reviewed again. Why do we have to review the Land Act all the time? Because it is broad. It's a broad act. Actually, the Land Act tries to amend the Registration of Titles Act, and we have had conflict there. Which law between the RTA and the Land Act is supreme? Those have been arguments of the academicians and the practitioners that the RTA remains supreme. And yet when you read the Land Act, the RTA tried to smuggle in some provisions which they could not put under the RTA. For example, Section 91. It's a provision which should have gone under the RTA on cancellation of title. But it is found under the Land Act. Why? Because the Land Act comes later when the RTA was drafted so many years ago. So we have the valuation bill in the offing. The draft is ready. Many of you have been consulted, professionals both in government and the private sector in the valuation field. A lot of workshops were conducted and the principles were submitted to cabinet. This law is expected to govern both the profession and the practitioners. So it's a two-in-one law. There have been arguments whether you need to separate valuers. Valuers are land surveyors. Rather, valuers are land economists from surveyors who are land surveyors. This is the time the marriage should end. And there's a lot of discussion around only that, whether they should remain together or they should separate at this material time. But the Act is going to regulate both practice and the professionals. So what seems to be coming through here is that valuation still remains an opinion. When you are working for government, your values may be considered to be lower than a valuer who is in private practice. So we want to harmonize and say that both valuations, whether you are returning your opinion as a private practitioner or you are in government, the opinion should not so much be what? There shouldn't be a lot of variance. So those are some of the issues. So there we have broken even. And the architects, who are the other part, and quantity surveyors, they are saying, hey, you have left us out. Where will we fall? Should we come up with our own law? So those are some of the areas that remain a little bit unclear. Then we are coming up with another law, the real estates law, to guide real estates in this country. And that is also in draft form, and it will be soon tabled to cabinet. And once cabinet gives it a blessing, we shall move into consultations and then parliament. So we have made some progress on each of these different laws. Maybe to give you information on the Land Act. The Land Act is still under review to place some of these provisions, especially around Milo. Where do you pay your ground rent for the occupants? Where should ground rent be paid? And in case you can't find your landlord, the people we call absentee landlords, where do you deposit Busulu? And then the other area is on these certificates of occupancy. Somebody was asking, are they on our land information system? When you visit some of our offices where certificates of occupancy are being issued, you'll have to check in the register at the respective ministry zone offices. They record it as an encumbrance, but an encumbrance which does not prohibit transfer. So it is an encumbrance which does not prohibit transfer. Certificates of customary ownership, they are in high stages of including it on the land information system so that we are able to know. But currently, if you want to do a search on certificates of customary ownership, you have to visit the respective sub-counties where these certificates are being issued. Nevertheless, because we don't have infrastructure at the sub-county level, you find that all our records are kept within the district land office. and that is where the register is kept. District Land Office, but in some places where the district happens to be where the Ministry Zone Office is located, we have used the Ministry Zone Office to store those records. So it will depend which area you are operating in. I'm glad also that somebody mentioned the issue of tenure security. How far have we gone in protecting people's land rights? I can say that the study will show us whether there is an improvement in tenure security, because tenure security is measured under a number of factors. And I'm glad Simon Peter mentioned we usually use the term continuum of land rights. You cannot measure by one factor, but you have to measure using that continuum of land rights. And we are saying land should not be looked at as land in terms of land ownership, but land should be looked at as a factor of production. I don't agree that we have not focused on that, because when you read the land policy itself, it is exactly mentioning that land, when you read the first chapters, what is Uganda's land question? Land in development. It points out that land will be having a bifocus, meaning that it should not only be looked at as ownership, but also in terms of a land for development. So there's a full chapter in there. They will help us, the study will help us to assess whether that aspect has been successfully implemented. How many days does it take to register land? Very interesting question. You cannot compare it to a permit. Why? Land has a bureaucratic process because we inherited the torrent system, which is paperwork, papers and papers. When you visit some of these countries where they have a deed system, they have less paper, and they've computerized their records. Everything is online. Uganda is just halfway in the computerization process. To get to a digital registry, you need a lot of things. You need to put in place a lot of things. That is why searches online are important, but we have not gotten to that stage. We need to have a digitized register. So what does that mean? You have to have computerized all your survey records. You need to have computerized all your physical planning records. You need to have digitized the valuation records. And you need to have digitized every record touching on land. But on our computerization process, we started with the titles only. And we did not cover their root, which is survey, land administration, valuation, and the other aspects. And it was then that we realized that only a title cannot say much if you don't have these other records, which we call the root of the title in our system. So the developers started on these other layers, as we call them. They included physical planning as a layer to be able to see what is the physical planning and land use of all these areas in the land information system. Then they added the valuation layer for collection of stamp duty and these other fees. So that was added. Now we added the land administration files, or especially of Uganda Land Commission, so that we are able to know what government owns, government land. And we had to do the inventories. Then we have had to add now what is in the offing, the layers for CCOs and COOs. That is where we are. We are not yet done. There's been an argument of creating a certificate of title for customary tenure. There's been a lot of discussion around this, whether the certificate of customary ownership is not enough, so that you just translate, rather transfer the components as listed in that COO to a CCT, because the land policy talks about a CCT, certificate of title for customary ownership. So there are two schools of thought. One is saying, put that register as a separate register. Others are, and at the sub-county. Others are saying, no, you already have freehold register, bylaw register, leasehold register. So just put customary what? Register. So that you have the four at par. That is another school of thought. Then we come up with these technical arguments. What does survey of customary land mean? Would it change the tenets of customary land as prescribed, that it is subject to clan, those rules and regulations of a community, such that if you surveyed it and gave it a plot and block number, that would automatically mean it is converted into a freehold? I've asked all these questions and we have not found the answers. The survey of customary land, is it not automatically going to change it to a freehold? And what will be the difference? Those are questions go to the surveyors. So those are the arguments that no, survey the customary land in its own form, give it a plot and block number, and it remain customary land. Others are saying no, use FFP to survey it and get it registered under the clean and PIN system, and it will remain customary land. So there are very many technical arguments, which is good for academicians to tell us whether the survey of customary land, in view of the characteristics as prescribed in the Land Act, will keep it customary, or it will definitely jump and become freehold. I'm speaking this because when you visit countries like Zambia and Ghana, they had the same arguments. But in Zambia, for example, when they would survey customary land, it would automatically jump into freehold. The same thing with Ghana. So here we are asking, how are we going to keep this customary land, give it a title, but it remains purely customary? I leave it to you for further discussion. Of course, UN Habitat, we thank them for supporting us, but there was another question of the policy looking at what is existing and building on it, other than bringing in new ideas. I love that, because that aspect is what we exactly focused on. I told you the Land Act had already been enacted, 1998, and the policy comes in 2013. There is no way you could ignore the Land Act and come up with entirely a new innovation and processes. We had to fit it within the existing legal framework. The other issue is land use. I want to give you information that land use, yes, the policy tackles, it has a full chapter on land use and sustainable land management. What you ought to note is that we have a fresh national physical development plan which was adopted by Cabinet this year in June, May or June. It's a fresh document on the table, and it now seals the framework on land use and land management in this country. And you are aware that the Physical Planning Act 2010 already declared the whole country as a planning area. And therefore, the National Physical Development Plan is now the framework which is going to govern land use in this country. It defines the users, areas, corridors for infrastructure. It's very comprehensive. Maybe you can grab a copy at the Ministry of Lands, and I understand it is soon going to be launched. The issue of taxation, I don't want to go without mentioning anything on it. Taxation. It was debated during our last land policy during the conference, and HE himself said, no, leave out taxation. Don't tax my people. I want to tax the what? The products they are producing. That taxation will bar land development. That was his argument. So we left out that one. But we provided for research. So you are reminding us that the area of taxation, we ought to have done a study. I think it was forgotten, that I need to raise it up with our consultants to see whether we can get some quick funding to undertake, even if it's a rudimentary study, as they call it. We need to do some bit of study around that area. Thank you for raising that. Tools, they have spoken about them, but the other area of women, Francis will handle. Why don't you make wills? Of course, culture, but a lot of work has been done for women. Stamp duty values, I've answered that. The law will regulate, and we are coming up with a national valuation data bank. The consultancy is in advanced stages to regulate the values between private and government. So that one will sort out issue of values. What is the cost of doing CCOs? This one I'll give it Professor Musinguzi. He's been a practitioner in that field. He will give us a more accurate figure of the cost of doing a CCO. Yes, very good programs not implemented. FFP, he will answer for it, why the Survey Act is not being fast-tracked to ensure that it covers new areas like FFP. I think those were the questions. If I did not pick yours, you can raise it again. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you so much, Madam Kabanda. Madam Kabanda is the Acting Director in the Ministry of Lands, Housing and Urban Development. So she speaks on behalf of government, and she speaks from a point of authority. She's the Director, Land Management, Ministry of Lands, Housing and Urban Development. Francis, there were questions directed to you with regard to women and land. Please take them on.
Thank you. I don't know if I also speak from a point of authority, or mine is just
to
have a conversation.
It's only government of Uganda that speaks from the point of authority. So we have only one government of Uganda on this panel.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. All right, so I'll just speak to the issues that are around women and gender that came from different people, and then I'll let the other panelists speak to the other technical issues. And I think, like, I started off by saying that the national land policy is very gender responsive. It has a very clear strategy on how to implement, to actualize the provisions that promote gender equality and the rights of marginalized people on land. So in terms of policy, in terms of law, as a country we are doing well. We can do better, but we are doing well. Now the challenge that we have is in the area of implementation. Of course, a lot has been done so far, but it's not enough still. There is a lot that still stands to be done. There are a lot of challenges that we face in implementing some of these provisions that are provided for. And some of the issues that you're talking about, for instance, why are people not writing wills? The issues around the fact that women in court are really suffering. That's the reality that women are living in our, in our own lives, in the communities that we work in, but even in our own spaces, workspaces, and so forth. We see that on one hand, we have very strong laws that are advancing women's land rights and rights for marginalized people, including the youth, but the reality is very different from what we have on paper. And a lot of things can be attributed to this, but one of the major issues, and again, it has been coming out very strongly from some of your submissions, is the fact that despite the fact that we have very strong laws, on the other hand, we also have very strong traditional or cultural norms. We have strong social and gender norms that really govern our ways of life. And in many circumstances, we find that these gender and social norms are actually very strong, very, very strong. That even if you have these laws that are very gender progressive, it is very difficult to implement them for as long as we have a system that is allowing both to work hand in hand. So that is the major challenge that we are facing, that we have these norms that are still existing, that are very strong, that are very powerful, and they guide our daily way, the way we interact with the land, the way we interact with each other. So that is still a challenge that we have. And as a solution, I think what has been presented by our laws is not working, I would say. For example, if you say education and awareness will be enough to transform or to change some of these discriminatory norms and practices, it can't work that way, because remember, we have been taught this for a very long time. I'm 45 years old, I'm 60 years old, I have been told that a girl cannot inherit land. And then you come with a one-off community sensitization or education program and you think I'll change what I believe in. So the fact that the interventions that we have currently as a solution are really not working, because these are deeply embedded norms and practices that we believe in that really control our ways of life. So coming in with a sensitization doesn't really work. What we propose is that we need to have gender transformative approaches integrated in the whole governance, land governance process. And what do I mean by gender transformative processes? Like I mentioned, community awareness raising or education is not a gender transformative approach. It is a gender sensitive or a gender responsive. It's aware that, it's making us aware that there is a problem, but does not transform the way I do things. It does not transform the way I think. It does not transform the way, what I have been taught over years. So we need to have really intentional approaches that work, especially at individual level, because we hold these customs as individuals, but also at household level, where power relations really play out very strongly. But also with communities, with institutions, and so forth, we see all these power relations between men and women really playing out very strongly. So we need to integrate those transformative approaches that allow conversations around the existing norms and practices and identify amongst those norms and practices which ones are harmful, which ones are destructive, which ones are, are not gender equitable. And then work with communities to interrogate these norms and transform them. One thing that we need to take into consideration is the fact that not all cultures or the norms that we have or practices are bad. There are some that are really progressive. And those need to be documented. Those need to be, upscaled. But we need to support communities to have these bold conversations around these customs. And if communities do not see a norm or a practice to be harmful to them as an individual, if you tell a man that, it's good to have your child, inherit land, but he does not see the value that comes from that to him as an individual or to the household, it will become very difficult for them to change from that practice. So communities have to be supported to interrogate, have these conversations, and identify those harmful practices, identify how it harms them, and also identify how it benefits them as individuals, if girls own property, if girls inherit property. Wills, for example, we have a norm around the fact that if you write a will, you will die. It's like you're bringing bad omen towards yourself, and it's a very, very strong norm down there. So how do you have conversations where people will actually change that perspective and appreciate the fact that actually if I write a will, it benefits me, it benefits my children, benefits my community, my household. If that does not happen, then we'll continue having these very good laws and norms and policies, but implementation will not happen because communities have not appreciated the goodness that comes in that. Then, in addition to that, there is also a catch. The catch is that to have these gender transformative approaches implemented at community level, at household level and at individual level, it requires patient funding. Now, how many people, how many institutions is government itself willing to patiently fund such a process? Because like I said, if this is something that I have been taught for 45 years, you're not going to come to me and talk to me in 1 or 2 sensitizations and I change. I need time, maybe not again another 45 years to change, but probably a week, just to have that conversation that will help me to see the value in transforming this normal practice that I have. So funding is very critical. And I think the challenge that we are facing is first the land sector, government itself, Ministry of Lands, is not well funded to take on some of these approaches that can actually actualize what is provided for in these policies. They do not have funds. Now, apart from if I don't sit there, but I don't think people have money. So if you don't have money, how are you going to implement? Yeah? But even as the practitioners, we have money, but these are very limited resources for us to undertake those approaches that will actually bring them. So we'll continue doing the sensitization, the awareness raising, and we tick off a box that we have done this. But these people will get the CCO, they will go back to their homes, and they will be beaten up by their husbands because you have not supported this couple to understand why the wife and the daughters are on that CCO. You just called them for one meeting and said, the law is saying that girls and women have a right to be on that CCO. They'll say, well, let's go ahead with that. But if the woman goes and says, now that I have my name there, is it okay if I can escort you to the bank when you're going to have this negotiation? That can cause domestic violence. Yeah, so we need to really think through funding the land sector, government, but also actors like civil society organizations need adequate funding, patient funding, to be able to have some of these approaches happen. The other issue that I would like to also talk about is around capacity building. Yes, the policy provides for strengthening capacity of land actors to implement the national land policy. But the conversations are not around issues related to gender. The capacity building is not related around the issues around the rights of marginalized people, the youth, people with disability on land. Remember, these majority of them being men are people that are also born within an environment that has these strong norms and cultures. And somehow they've made it to these spaces where they make decisions, where they provide land services. But how many of them know about what the gender strategy says on the implementation of the national land policy? So capacity strengthening, especially for land actors at local level, including traditional authorities, to understand issues around gender, issues around women's land rights, and also for them to appreciate what benefits come if in their provision of these services, they promote the rights and advance the rights of women and the rights of marginalized communities. So all these issues really rotate around the fact that we have very good laws and we are investing a lot of resources in really strengthening these laws. It's high time that we take some action around really intentionally thinking through those approaches that will change the way we think, the way we act, and the way we relate with each other, and also the way we relate with land as a resource. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Francis, for the comments. I realize that we have less than 30 minutes to be out of here. When we get the comments, we are going to also receive closing remarks from the team here, but you can also make your own as you close, and we'll see if we can have a few more questions within the remaining minutes.
Thanks, moderator. I'm the one who received the least questions. I'll start with the one that was directed to me on tenure responsive land use planning. So as I explained before, this is a tool that is being developed or has been developed by the Global Land Tool Network to change the thinking about land use planning being implemented separate from land tenure security improvement. So the tool is primarily advocating for an integrated approach where land use planning is implemented together with land tenure security improvement for two reasons. One is to make sure that land use planners are intentionally thinking about how their actions affect the land tenure security of the communities they are planning for. The second reason is that if you look at the land use planning processes and land tenure security improvement, there are a lot of activities that are similar in both processes. So how do we bring them together so that we promote a more cost-effective but also a more impactful process? So this is what this tool is primarily about. There is a guide that is available on how to implement the tenure responsive land use planning in country level interventions that is developed by the Global Land Tool Network. We have piloted this approach together with Makerere University and Ministry of Lands, Housing and Urban Development in one of the sub-counties in Kabale district, Kitumba sub-county. It's a rural sub-county. As you know, land use planning has been extended also to rural areas. Traditionally, it's only in urban areas. However, the actual implementation of that has not yet been scaled up. So this particular sub-county is the first sub-county where which has been supported to develop a statutory plan, land use plan, and it's a rural sub-county using this approach. One of the other things within this approach that we promoted was a more bottom-up approach where communities are the one in the lead in terms of determining their development priorities. And this is not always the case in the traditional planning processes. So this is one of the things we were looking at. The other one is we were also looking at promoting climate smart land use planning, where the communities, together with their leaders, identify entry points for promoting climate resilience and addressing issues related to climate change. And then the last one is that because this was a sub-county close to the municipality, we also looked at how can we do planning that will promote urban-rural linkages with the understanding that a lot of activities being done in the rural areas are being done to actually provide services in the urban areas. So the two areas are interdependent. And so we were looking at entry points within the planning to actually improve that. So there is a pilot that has been done, and this is one of the roles of development partners, to pilot innovative approaches together with government, and then the experiences and lessons can be taken up by government and scaled up to the rest of the country. So there is a case that you can look at in this regard. There was also a question on youth strategies. I mean, strategies that are being implemented to address issues related to young people. So one of the things we are doing as the Global Land Tool Network is within the different interventions, we have a tool called Youth and Responsiveness Criteria. So we use this tool before we start any land intervention to assess what are the needs and the challenges of young people. And so this tool helps us to be able to, together in a participatory process, to identify entry points and strategies for addressing needs of young people, but also to promote their participation. We have learned that young people have very unique needs from other people when it comes to access to land, but also when it comes to participation in land governance processes. And Director knows that there are many of our laws which discriminate against young people because there is an age limit. So young people are not able to be represented in certain land governance or land management committees and land management institutions because they have not attained the age to participate or to be considered on those committees. So one of the things we are doing is, because we are promoting the fit-for-purpose land administration, the technology that is being used, we find that young people adapt to that technology really fast. So we have encouraged the adoption of young people to be the ones to lead in terms of spatial data capture, but also the management of the data. So these young people, through these processes, are being empowered. It's making them interested in land, because a lot of young people are not interested in land-related activities, especially agriculture and others. A lot of young people are given land and they quickly sell it. They prefer the urban lifestyle. So, their involvement in these activities and the capacity building and training is renewing their interest in land governance. And we have many examples of young people who have been engaged, and as a result, have been able to be co-opted on some of the land management institutions. Some of the young people have been able to go back to school and train as land surveyors and other built environment professionals. So this is really helping a lot. Obviously, we can do much more. And I think we are also very interested in the conversation of what more we can do to ensure youth-inclusive land governance. Lastly, I also wanted to comment about land service provision. There was a comment on how, especially the local government land management institutions are not able to provide land services. I think as development partners, we are asking government to rethink the business model for providing land services. We have seen in many countries and in many other regions that land services are self-sustaining. And you can put in place a self-sustaining system where people pay a small fee for land services, and the revenue that is generated can be reinvested back to provide more land services. So this is the business model we are asking our government counterparts to think about, to rethink the land service provision, especially looking at local government, because the current model is not working. If you go in many areas, land services usually begin with area land committees, but usually they are not capacitated to be able to provide land services. District land boards, similar story. District land offices, similar stories. In one of the districts I was recently, I was told that the entire district land office has an annual budget of 2 million Ugandan shilling. What can you do with that if that is your annual budget? So there are insurmountable challenges when it comes to land service provision, and we want to work with our government counterparts to be able to address this. But at the same time, they are good practices or good experiences in countries within the region where they have been able to transform land service provision. So one of our role as development partners is also to share and facilitate exchange of knowledge between different governments, our government and others that have been able to create solutions so that they can come back here and think what could be the fit-for-purpose solution for Uganda to address the challenge of land service provision. I'll stop here for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon Peter. Professor, you have, thank you. Professor, you have 5 minutes so that we use the remaining 3 minutes to wind up the discussion.
Thank you very much, moderator. I know, of course, you are constrained with time, but you can cut off me anytime. I'm also a speculator, just like Madame Francis. I don't speak authoritatively. So, having said that, one, I'll first begin with a comment from Arosius, President ISU. The last item of taxation, maybe at some point we shall also have another dialogue here about the relationship between land and politics. Most of the provisions in the land policy may not be deterministic, but they might be influenced by politics, and taxation is one of them. But also, you know that in Uganda, nobody likes taxation. It's a culture that we actually have. So I think some part of it explains. Then David, the lawyer, you mentioned many things, but I would also like to say that apart from lack of awareness, I think there is also an element of selfishness, because encroachment on the natural resources, sometimes people know, but they end up encroaching. You talked about the important point of surveyors being killed, and the president of ISU is listening. If you ask every surveyor that has worked for more than 5 years in Uganda, he or she will tell you that at one point, they were either lynched or about to be lynched. So it's a very big problem. Then Elijah, and also I want to answer the question from the director about this thing of CCOs having them block numbers. One, I think there is a lot of confusion there, and yet the solution is very clear. When you look at the land administration domain model, which we all use, we are dealing with 3 things mainly. You are dealing with land, how to describe land, and that one is done by the surveyors. Then you are dealing with parties. Parties are who owns it, who uses it, and so on. Then now you have the rights. These are 3 different things. So to me, surveyors are responsible for defining the land. And you don't have to use so many names. The role of a surveyor is to make sure that you have properly demarcated the land and there is no land which overlaps the other. Then you can even give them a uniform way of referring to them. You can survey all the land. Then now the people who determine rights will come and say, this one is customary, this one is freehold, this one, whatever rights you have defined. So this discussion actually should not be about how have you surveyed it or how have you named it. It should be about what rights do you want. You can ask a person, do you want a freehold? Then they say, yes, I want a freehold. Then a neighbor, do you want a CCO? The person will say, I want a CCO. But the method that we have used to survey and even name should not have any entry into the discussion point. Then Prosper, maybe the director has explained about this issue of valuation, and actually we used to have it when I was still in SLB, having different valuations different values for the same property. In addition to the bill, I think the ministry is also undertaking a study on professionalization of valuation framework. So I think it should also address some of those things. Then Maria, about the cost. The cost of fit for purpose land administration depends, one, on the method that you are going to use and the quality of storage. We know in some countries like Ethiopia, they are saying that they used $1 for registering a parcel. But we found out that actually for them, they are not surveying. They were just asking you, do you have land? Yes, I have land. How much land do you have? 20 acres. They give you a certificate. Or, in Rwanda, they used $6. $6. In Rwanda, they had nothing almost at the beginning, and they used fit for purpose. They did an aerial survey, they got orthophotos, and then they marked on the orthophotos. In Uganda, our estimation is between $20 and $30, because for us, we have already established a land information system, and all the parcels that we survey must go into the land information system, which means the quality should be a little bit higher. Then Peter, on land use, one person owning land, I think that one I will not talk about it, but the aspect I want to talk about, which we have been discussing, is land use planning. The way we live, mainly in rural areas, where people are scattered everywhere, making service delivery a complication. How do we deal with it? How do we go in each sub-county and you say, let people live in one part, and then we clear the other one for agriculture? It has a lot of cultural issues. For example, people want to bury next to them. How are you going to tell people maybe to bury their dead in a cemetery? So it needs technical people, it needs anthropologists, it needs politicians, and so many other people. But to me, I see we have a problem if we don't go that route. Then Apollo, fit for purpose land administration, maybe the director will mention later on authoritatively that there is already a strategy. Government has already developed a strategy, a country implementation strategy for fit for purpose land administration that covers the entire country. Then Innocent, about a title taking 6 months, how can this improve? The answer is, let's adopt fit for purpose land administration. In Rwanda, and the director has mentioned that we are not computerized. All these things will be once we have computerized. Rwanda is 100% computerized, and it takes 4 days. These things take 4 days. Of course, she has put it right. A land title is not a permit, it's not a driving permit. It cannot take 1 hour. But it is not taking 6 months, it is taking only 4 days. Christine, yours I think has been answered. Then Robert, about CCOs. One, the director has mentioned about the CCO register. Currently, we have these registers at the sub-county, but they're highly fragmented. And I know the ministry has been also making efforts to bring a central register for CCOs. However, the problem that we have is the Land Act, which puts them at the sub-county. Rightly so, because most of these rural people want services nearer to them. So to me, I think we can go ahead with the proposal to have the register centralized. But then the actual people who manage them, who manage the register, can be at the sub-county, and they interact through technology. That also adds LIS.
1 more minute,
One more
Professor.
minute, yes. Flavia, I think I would also like to raise your question to Madame Francis about research. I think it was not answered about which research can be done, given that we have good provisions in the land policy, but women's rights are still low. Then Hadija, I think I've also answered your question about LIS. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, my panelists. Thank you so much, Madam Naomi Kabanda, Ms. Francis Birungi Odong, Mr. Mwesije Simon Peter, and Professor Musinguzi. I know we've talked about the national land policy, what it is, the challenges. We've talked about other pieces of legislation that have to be amended. We've talked about women and land and the other vulnerable groups, the gender criteria, and the attendant laws, the Succession Act and its amendments, the challenges and the contribution to the national land policy. We've had discussions around the tools available, the 25 tools, and the support to government and CSOs by the development partners, UN Habitat, and that we are looking at the affordability and how they are used to capture data. And we've extensively talked about the fit-for-purpose tools that are available to us and how they interact with the mainstream torrent system. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for being a great group of participants. We ask our conveners, we ask Dr. Ronald Sengendo to come and make the closing remarks. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mwebe. A round of applause to our panel and the moderator. A round of applause to our participants online. And a round of applause to you here. Thank you so much for being here. I'll just give you a few statistics. We had 100 physical participants and 150 online. And there are many questions online which we couldn't answer because of time. But this discussion will continue tomorrow, and Friday is the 7th Advances in Geomatics Research Conference. It's going to take place at CTF2. CTF2 is the new central teaching facility near the main library, starting at 9, and actually at 9:30, Professor Msing has a presentation on fit for purpose and the spatial infrastructure, again trying to address some of the issues that we've been talking about here. It's going to be a wonderful 2 days, so I ask you to please join us tomorrow at the CTF2, and we'll continue this discussion. And this discussion is going to continue online also on our YouTube channel. And hopefully, like Professor suggested, maybe next time we'll discuss land and politics, how politics affects issues of land. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for being a wonderful audience. I want to wish you a nice evening. Travel safe. Thank you so much.